You are listening to Women's Running Stories, where exceptional women runners share inspirational stories about their running experiences. Hello and welcome. I am Cherie Louise Turner. I am the host and producer of Women's Running Stories. And this week, I'm switching things up. Women's Running Stories is taking a break this week, and I wanted to use this opportunity to introduce you to a women's sports podcast I know you will love. And that is Unexpected Curves, hosted and produced by Olympian and professional runner Marielle Hall. Unexpected Curves is the weekly sports show that gives the girls some support. Every week, Marielle and her guest dive into a new topic that has to do with the culture surrounding women in sport. And to do that, Marielle talks to athletes and experts to learn how their work impacts our world of play. Marielle takes a lot of left turns to get to the right answers. Said another way, this show lives up to its name of delivering content that is unexpected. Marielle has explored topics like typography in track and field and discussing if stadiums are sexist. Marielle has a truly unique way of approaching women's sports, and she has great guests. She is also a thoughtful, terrific interviewer, and yeah, I just love this show. Every week, I look forward to what topic Marielle is going to cover and how she is going to approach it. The episode I'm featuring here is titled From Hand Games to Handoffs: How Black Girls Played Their Way to Track and Field Dominance, and it features Professor Amira Rose Davis. For women's sports podcast fans, you'll also know Amira Rose Davis as the co-host of the terrific feminist podcast Burn It All Down, which is currently on hiatus. Before we get into this episode, please know you can look to the show notes for how to keep up with Unexpected Curves and Marielle, and also where you can listen to the show. So as soon as you're done listening here, go over to Unexpected Curves, subscribe, and catch up on all the other great episodes Marielle has already published. That's going to do it for me. I'll be back next week with a new episode of Women's Running Stories. And now, let's get to it. Please enjoy this episode of Unexpected Curves.
If this is our girl of tomorrow, with her broad shoulders and flat chest, who has no stamina, who's not strong, if that is our girl of tomorrow, then who will her children be? And this idea that actually was like, in order to bring about strong babies for the race, this is very eugenic language, you had to provide Black girls with opportunity to get fit and to be strong and to be tough. And you had to do that by opening up avenues of play. And that looked like calisthenics, that looked like running, it looked like jumping, but it also started to look like formalized and organized sport.
Avoid risk, play it safe, be passive. Everything about growing up from a girl to a woman tells us that we should leave games behind, that we should get serious and get it right. The margin for error feels small, and the opportunity for creative control in our experiences seems limited. Take, for example, the HP report that found that men will apply for a job if they meet only 60% of the qualifications. Women will apply only if they meet 100% of the qualifications. But before the socialization of perfection, these women were girls playing games. Hand games, if you look closely, provide the possibility of a new world, a language created to connect girls to their peers, their bodies, and their voices. Black Girls Play is an ESPN short documentary that illustrates the connection between the safe spaces created through the games and the musical genres that define us as a nation. If games like Slide, Gigolo, Miss Mary Mac, and Double Dutch are turning into our music, our popular culture, then they must live in our athletes. And in thinking about the concentrated amount of Black American girls in track and field, I wanted to know why that was and how the traditions of our youth live in the sport we watch today. On the show, we are going to get into why play is so important, how it gets professionalized through sport, athletes' bodies as storytellers, and what we can learn from the call and response format of hand games. Joining me for the conversation is Amira Rose Davis, Assistant Professor in the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas, where she specializes in 20th century American history with an emphasis on race, gender, sports, and politics. She is also the co-host of the Burn It All Down podcast and the host of Season 3, American Prodigies. Amira, welcome to the show. We're going to get into the work of Kyra Gaunt, author of the Games Black Girls Play that inspired the ESPN short documentary Black Girls Play. But first, 3 questions we start every show with. Where are you? What are you working on? And who in women's sports are you watching?
I'm so happy to be here. I'm in Austin, Texas, at the University of Texas at Austin. Hookem.
Yes.
And I am working on 15 million things always. I am finishing up my first book called Can't Eat a Medal, which looks at the history of Black women in sports in the Jim Crow era, right up to the dawn of Title IX. And it looks at their experience in sports, but also the way that people use their bodies as symbols for a variety of other things and the gap between those lived experiences and symbolic uses.
Okay.
I just wrapped a few video essays for ESPN for Women's Final Four and the start of the NWSL season as well. And of course, it's the Olympic year, so there's always a few things percolating. 2 years ago, we did a long form podcast on the history of Black girls in gymnastics. And so we're getting ready to look at what happens at Olympic trials. What we predicted 2 years ago is that the team was going to be 80% Black, if not more, and it's looking like that's probably the case. And I have a children's book on Wilma Rudolph activism coming out with Bloomsbury Press in July in time for the games. So
Congratulations. Staying busy.
Yes. So it's a bit of a busy year.
That's actually how I first found your voice, was the American Prodigies podcast. So I love that storytelling. And then who in women's sports are you watching? It can be a person, it could be a team, it could be from the administrative side, anything.
I love the work that Drea and Elle Duncan and Chene are doing behind the desk as commentators on the women's game. They had an excellent run during March Madness. It was really tremendous to see Black women transition from athletes to the commentating desk, but also like their analysis, their chemistry, everything was really spot on. It was just wonderful to see. And I think that they offer such a rich analysis about the game that I really like. I would be remiss to not shout out the U.S. Women's National Team, specifically my former student, Sam Coffey. They won She Believes Cup in PKs over Canada. And then lastly, as we gear up for the Olympics, I'm always rooting for Anna Cockrell. And I have had the pleasure of collaborating with her on a bunch of stuff. And I know that she's been training, and I just feel very strongly about, about her year. So I'm excited for what we'll see out of her in Paris.
I don't know Anna personally, but I do love watching her and just kind of seeing her full journey from a collegiate athlete to an incredible competitor. We're going to get back to track and field later in the show, but first we're talking hand games. We're talking the performance of play. Hand games in the film are introduced as a way that Black girls learn about the rules of social identity, the perception of our bodies, our friendship dynamics, how we think, how we collaborate. Did you play these games growing up, or from observation, how do you think the messages from these games live in us as adults?
Yeah, I certainly played them. I was more of a tomboy, so I cut my identity by trying to avoid them, if that makes sense. But I do think that you see the way that it is this kind of signifier, especially in elementary school. We were in a predominantly white area, and this feeling like, oh, we had a language all to ourselves because we just knew it. I don't think anybody ever stopped to try to figure out why that was or how we came to have these things passed down. It was just everybody knew how to do it, and there might be variants, but it was just this kind of feeling about it. The other thing that came to my mind when you asked the question was how certain stomp and shake styles were a passport to being grown. My back is aching, my brows to tie, my booty shaking from left to right. There was something so affirming about saying that in middle school. It was almost transgressive, like a graduated cheer, and especially the more we would put movement on it. And it's funny on reflection to think about what felt so enticing about that, especially at a time where you're leaving games behind and you're being a teenager and all this
Mhm.
stuff. But that particular expression carried with it a lot of the earlier iterations, but was like slightly next level. And I think there was like a certain excitement around that.
There are all these other signals that we hear about, like your menstrual cycle, how your body changes. But really, to your point, the games offer those early curiosity breadcrumbs of, okay, what does the next stage of playground to the world, what does that look like? How do you get there? A lot of those messages seep into these games in that way. Talking a little bit more specifically about track and field and the connection to these games, like a lot of the sport is built on learning how to live with discomfort in your body. It's finding the edge, riding it, pushing past it. It's a sport that really celebrates head-to-head competition as well as your human limits. And on the flip side of this really beautiful examination, the sport also deals with a lot of critique in physique and femininity, expectation that your body does these incredible things, but also that it's not feminine enough. How do you feel like the expectation of what a body should do, how it should move, how does that show up, particularly for Black women, for Black girls in their experience in sport?
The overarching thing that we see historically, and we could even trace it to now, is how fine a line Black girls and women walk between what's respectable and what's not, what's transgressive and what's not, and what your body should do is always really on the edge of what it shouldn't do. So you should want to be a mom, but not too soon and not too late, right?
Mm-hmm.
You should want to be feminine, but not over sexualize, right? You
Mm-hmm.
want to be active, but not too active, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can play games, but only those that affirm your femininity, none that would somehow subvert that or trouble your reproduction. This was early 20th century, really at a time where the prevailing science, generally speaking, about women's bodies was so preoccupied with this. There's people who said, oh, if you get hit by a soccer ball in your stomach, you're going to be infertile. There were articles taken out in the Black press, for instance, a doctor writing in the Amsterdam News who said all these modern women who are jumping and running and climbing, they're going to stand up and their uterus is going to fall out. And then what will their purpose be, essentially, right? But at the same time, Ruth Arnett in Chicago in the 20s, who was looking at a group of Black girls congregating outside her window. And she said, if this is our girl of tomorrow with her broad shoulders and flat chest, who has no stamina, who's not strong, if that is our girl of tomorrow, then who will her children be? And this idea that actually was like, in order to bring about strong babies for the race, this is very eugenic language, you had to provide Black girls with opportunity to get fit and to be strong and to be tough. And you had to do that by opening up avenues of play. And that looked like calisthenics, that looked like running, it looked like jumping, but it also started to look like formalized and organized sport. So even at a time where organized sport for girls generally was shrinking, because of those logics in the Black community, you saw expansive opportunities in some places that introduced competitive athletics really early on. It's why Black women came to dominate track and field. And by the time you get to the 1948 Olympics, 9 out of 12 girls on the US women's track team are Black girls. Every point one at the Olympic was a Black girl from a HBCU. They came through programs that were competitive, that offered scholarships well before anybody else offered scholarships. So they did have these opportunities. And that was born out of this logic. You needed to be strong so your body could do what it's supposed to do. And the more you won, especially against interracial competition, the more credit you brought to the race. And that opened up avenues. And so these ideas didn't stop once people got into the game, but they also shaped how the game was then played and participated in. So track and field continues to be a really helpful example here, because unlike tennis or golf, where there was a kind of permissibility there, track was conditionally acceptable if you were sprinting. It was conditionally acceptable if you also made sure that you were still presenting as feminine. One of the most dominant programs, Tennessee State University, headed by Ed Temple, he said, I want foxes, not oxes, right? And he went out of his way to make sure that everybody powdered their face and straightened their hair before talking to a reporter after a meet. he overemphasized not only their sexuality, but the fact that they were not gay, the fact that they were feminine, the fact that after they ran track, they would hang up their cleats and don an apron. That's a quote.
Mm-hmm.
Gender policing was happening within organized sports, introduced at the 68 games. A lot of that gender policing was happening on Black and brown bodies, and it was a very invasive gender verification test that included being paraded, poked, prodded. And so part of Temple's statements also need to be understood in this kind of like, I'm protecting them from further scrutiny.
Mm-hmm.
But I think all of that just adds to how tight that tightrope was that girls were walking, even with increased opportunities to play.
It also sounds like this early onset of Black girls being introduced to sport was the beginning of the performance of play, not just here's the sport, go after it. It's how do we dress up this person and this thing that they're doing so that it can be something to be proud of as a race, something to showcase, something to sell for acceptance. Another point that you made about the adultification bias towards Black girls and Black women, of their expectation of being more mature, and the ripple effect of that treatment for how they're treated for law enforcement, how they're treated in schools, and then naturally for our conversation, how coaches perceive them, how advertisers display them, how media talks about them. What does that bias do to the stories that we hear about Black women, Black girls playing games? Also, if sport is built on potential, how do we cut potential short for people if we've already said they're more mature in their process than their non-Black competitor?
I think we see this in a few different ways. You can see that box of that you have to fit in to be marketable. Even when opportunities expand, that box doesn't really expand quite as fast. If you take somebody like Wilma Rudolph competing in the 60s, one of the reasons why she was such a darling, besides her success, is that they called her dainty, that she was fair skinned, that they said she was long and leggy, right? She was like the image of this kind of beauty standard, versus Earlene Brown, shot putter at the time, who was not described like that at all. Who they talked about her size, how dark she was, that she was heavy set, right? Those are very different in terms of endorsement deals. The go-to example that a lot of people think about is Serena Williams and Maria Sharapova, who has Serena holds a 17-2 record against, but was out earning, doubling up what Serena was getting in endorsement deals, because the market logics were still based in this kind of racial capital that devalued Black girls and Black womanhood in terms of advertising opportunities. You continue to see that around faces of the league, and as the 1990s hit and women's sports explode in basketball and in soccer, you have this effort, even when they have stars like Lisa Leslie and Cheryl Swoops, this effort to continue to feminize and continue to try to scrunch all the narratives into a described box about what is acceptable. One of the examples that I use when I'm teaching this in classes, I talk about Clarissa Shields, two-time Olympian gold medal boxer. And there's a great documentary, T-Rex, about her journey. And in it, there's a very stirring scene where she's trying to say, why don't I get endorsement deals like Gabby Douglas, right? I have the gold medals, I have this story. And the folks sitting around with her saying, cool, we're working to get you those, but we need you to stop saying you like to hit people. To which Clarissa, of course, says, but I'm a boxer, right? And so this idea that you can market a Black girl in gymnastics, it might not be Mary Lou Retton, right? And it might be trying to emphasize different things, or actually downplay their Blackness, or overemphasize their body type or whatever, but it's still a feminine, affirming sport, right? You can market a Black girl even in track and field at the time, but boxing, step too far, right? And that's part of those limited opportunities. The other way that those narratives take hold is this idea about what Black girls' bodies are meant to do and how they're meant to play also tracks them into very specific sports. When I talk about these early sporting opportunities at Black institutions, see golf teams, we see swim teams, we see archery, we see badminton, we have wrestlers, we have bowlers, we have figure skaters, all competing in the mid-century. And one of the things that becomes very pronounced around the time of Title IX, the same exact time that we have women's sports in general exploding, right? The fastest growing women's sports are also the least diverse. Field hockey, lacrosse, swimming routinely have less than 3% of girls playing them who are Black girls. The sports of track and field and of basketball are where Black girls have been overrepresented. What we've seen is when you have Black girls coming up playing or show athletic opportunity, they are tracked and pushed into basketball and track and steered away from tennis, steered away from field hockey, steered away from motorsport. That limiting opportunities that you speak about, that's what we're seeing in real time. Now, we're in a very exciting moment in which a lot of people have made inroads and put in work. So whether it's the influence of Zena Garrison or the Williams sisters in tennis that made Naomi Osaka's dad and Coco Gauff's dad go out and say, oh, my daughter can do this, and build representation. Or if it's a bobsledder like Elena Myers Taylor, who single-handedly went out and recruited Black girls from track and field to go push bobsleds and transform that team that was 90% white into now 7 out of 9 members of the U.S. women's bobsled team are Black women. That is based on one person's singular effort. Gymnastics is also growing, and that has a lot to do with not only representation from Dominique Dawes, Betty Okino, to Gabby, to Simone, but also things like Simone opening her gym where there's safety and where there's appreciation of body difference. And that is the type of institution building that has started to create inroads and more possibilities in a variety of sport. Because to your point, narratives that tell a single story about how Black girls' bodies and Black women's bodies should move or should behave or should play don't only limit our perception of Black girls and women, but also translate into the actual material opportunities that are presented as options as well.
It's a credit of just mentorship, how important that is, that we facilitate our own connections and we can wait for people to catch on to the importance of us playing and us participating in a variety of arenas and sports. But I think particularly the example of gymnastics just shows how important mentorship is and how it can completely elevate and change the sport overnight. One thing that I really thought was interesting in the book, this isn't in the film, but it's in the book, that kind of mentions, is that she's surprised that more Black girls aren't producers or sound engineers, despite having this early skill set and reverence for making beats, making music. The same pattern shows up in sport, it shows up in track and field. We're dominating in the sport, but there aren't a ton of meet directors, there aren't a ton of coaches, there aren't a ton of people in these administrative roles orchestrating to what we were just discussing, the mentorship around the sport. Why do you think that is, and how do you build past those dynamics to create something that has a little bit more inclusivity in all parts of the sport?
Absolutely. I think this is a really, really important question because oftentimes when we talk about sports, we hyper focus on the field or the court and we miss the entire landscape. So I returned to Title IX for a few reasons. One, because while it has been applauded for opening up doors and pathways for girls and women in sport as athletes, it also closed down professional opportunities as coaches, managers, administrators, trainers, etc. When the legislation was passed, 90+% of college coaches for women's sports, for instance, were women, and now that's under 50% today. It's like 46%, right? That's a loss. That's a net loss. And I think that one of the things that's really instructive is almost immediately as Title IX starts to be implemented, Black women commission a survey to talk about Black women first being pushed out of their jobs for white women and then for white men as women's sports start to professionalize. And so this idea that there's a use for Black women's athletic bodies, but not their minds, I think is very similar to a general story about Black bodies and Black minds in sports. It's just that we've hyper focused on it in terms of men in football and basketball to a lesser extent. And it's just lagged behind in terms of consideration about Black women. But we can see it play out. There's a great organization, Brown Girls Do Gymnastics, that has tried to and has done a lot of efforts to get Black girls in the sport. But one of the things that they do is they hold an invitational in which every athletic trainer, every judge, every person in the entire landscape of the meet is a Black woman. And they talk about how affirming that space is. Having these discussions about value and worth beyond what you produce in your body as an athlete is really necessary, not just because we're thinking about what happens to athletes after their career ends, but because people who are going to flip the script in the space that they're in, I think adds to the possibilities and opens up those spaces even more. We were just talking about value and narratives and marketing. Black women agents, ad execs, photographers who can light Black people on magazine covers, people who are not going to use animalistic terms to describe a Black women athlete. And so if you're really into sports and maybe your path is not through playing it, being able to see somebody who's a journalist can be that light bulb that goes off to say, I can write about sports. And what stories will that next Black woman tell as a beat reporter that might not have otherwise been told? And so I think that this is why this conversation is really important. And that question about why that has happened structurally is really the tale as old as time in terms of what's valued and who's rendered disposable. We've moved to a place where Black girls and Black women's bodies at play, especially in sport, are hyper visible. At the same time, this is divorced from their actual humanity and lived experience. And what happens in that regard is their athletic labor is then used while the full breadth of what they're saying and impact of their experience drops away. So as soon as you're not as fast, or as soon as you break out of whatever box that you're put in. So do you get angry like Serena? Do you get slower and then you're not winning? Do you get politically engaged, right? Like in what ways do Black girls and Black women become rendered disposable and suddenly find themselves on the margins of sport once again? And I think that is part of what we're trying to disrupt when we think about the wide landscape of sports and games and play, and the invitation to not cede any area. Sometimes, again, we get caught up in wanting to have the same circular conversations that center on the play itself. As we know, the meanings that we derive from it extend so far beyond that one point of play that it also requires us and invites us to consider this larger zoomed out picture and all of the work that could be done there to continue to make sure that Black girls and Black women have space and freedom to play and participate and thrive in any location that they choose to do.
To that point, the hand games were a symbol of without this capitalist structure, without investment from a very young age, Black girls were able to show up, be their authentic selves, and have this expression. And in a way, I feel like sport offers that extension of girlhood. If these games are in our popular culture, if they're in our music, if they're our athletes, the games that we're playing are becoming an extension of our girlhood. And if we can protect the sports, if we can protect the narratives around it, we can extend that girlhood and we can extend play, which we know is so important for a multitude of reasons, not just entertainment. It holds a lot, I think, for our cultural identity and just the way that we express ourselves and the way that we see the world. So,
and author Black womanhood on our own terms.
I think that's the goal, no matter what. Thank you so much for your time.
Hear Her Sports is a podcast for everyone who loves stories by and about women striving to improve and make a difference in their lives. I am your host, Elizabeth Emery, a former professional cyclist. In every episode, I introduce a female athlete or woman in the business of sport through a thoughtful conversation about who they are and the terrific work they're doing. My guests and I explore the glorious and frustrating issues in sports, history, equity, training, nutrition, and so much more. Join us for inspiration, for community, and for love of being a strong, athletic woman.